Hello, everyone, and welcome to Psyched Out, a podcast focused on all things psychology, like psychological thrillers, unethical experiments, true crime, cults, and more. I am your host, Emily, and for those who don't know, I have a bachelor's degree in forensic psychology and a background in law enforcement. This helps me provide unique insight on some of the world's most famous cases, movies, and events. In today's episode, we'll be talking about the Netflix documentary, The Crash. I have been informed that there are other documentaries on the same case. However, I don't have Hulu, so unfortunately, we're going to do this episode based around the Netflix documentary. And my goal is to answer some of the questions that people had for me on TikTok when I made like my 10-minute breakdown video, and then to do more of a deep dive into the documentary as a whole. I actually just finished watching it a second time and took a lot of extensive notes, so we're going to go ahead and jump into it. If you guys like this type of content, please don't forget to like, comment, and subscribe. I do my best to make content that is ethical. And without further ado, we're going to go ahead and get started. So, the documentary opens with an officer arriving on the scene of the crash. And I have to say, his reaction is very relatable. When you see the damage the car did to the wall alone, you're going to be shocked. It actually had my jaw just open. I was appalled because I'd never really thought that a car could do that type of damage to a brick wall. And the fact that the outline of the damage is car shaped, like it was just very compelling and very shocking. I will say that the officers acted in a very reasonable and swift manner given the circumstances, but I really hate that they had to witness something like that because I can't imagine what that did or what that felt like to them. I myself haven't seen a car accident or any scene really like that brutal before, which I'm very thankful for. Knock on wood, I have yet to even go to a suicide scene. However, there are aspects of the job that stick with you, even if it isn't a brutal crime. For instance, I remember the first time I had to do CPR on somebody. It was an elderly woman who was approximately 90 years old at the time. And I try not to think about it just because it upsets me, but I can still picture doing CPR and feeling like her sternum and her ribs just crunching under my hands. And I know it's stupid, but I told her that I was sorry like 18,000 times because I just felt so bad. And even though I knew she couldn't hear me, I just felt like it needed to be said. And again, this isn't in comparison to the crash accident, but just keep in mind, like, those officers saw something that they really shouldn't have had to see. And they're also a victim in this when you think about it and what Mackenzie did. And I just don't think people really recognize how much that must have sucked for them because no matter what, that stuff goes home with you, right? So at the end of the day, this is something that they're going to think about for a very long time. We then very quickly transition to Rosie, someone I have a lot of strong feelings about, but I'll do my best to make clear what is my opinion and then what is my analysis of her. And one thing that immediately sticks out to me is Rosie's speech. She still talks very juvenile, very childlike, but she specifically discusses Dom and Davion in the present tense and not the past tense, which is very interesting. And what this indicates to me is that she's still in a lot of denial about what happened, or there's, to play devil's advocate, the directorial process where they said, hey, don't do that. But I think she was so natural at using present tense that that's her mindset. She still discusses like they're alive and that they're still present when they aren't. And that's a mindset that's very difficult to change. If she had been using past tense regularly, she would have had to have thought about using that a lot more, like switching to present tense if that was a directorial choice. So I think she genuinely just discusses Dom and Davion as if they're still alive. And I think that's very apparent throughout the snippets of her interview process. We get a few more shots of officers and firefighters rescuing Kenzie from the vehicle, and then we ultimately transition to the hospital. And this is the first time we're introduced to Kenzie's parents. And I will say right off the bat, their surprise to me really isn't that believable. Now, people react differently in shock, and people react differently in grief. But really stands out to me is how the dad immediately looks to the mom for reassurance. Now, the mom is locked in on the officer who's relaying the information. And I guess it could be that he's concerned about her, but he seems to not really be processing that information and looking to her for some type of indication on what to do next, how to behave, or what to say. And while she's looking at the officer, the dad is looking at her like he doesn't know what to do with himself. He doesn't know if he should be concerned the way that she's being concerned or what. And again, as I mentioned, everybody grieves differently. So, maybe I'm off base here. But I have seen personally some very strange reactions myself in my line of work to different things. And they always seemed more natural than this. Um, and I'll be honest, I think part of it is because, in my opinion, they really aren't surprised something like this could happen involving their daughter, given the fact that they knew about the marijuana usage, they knew about mushroom usage, along with other drugs. They knew that she was driving. And then on top of that, we have to believe, at least in their opinion, that there's this POTS diagnosis, which gets mentioned later. So to them, they had to have had this thought at some point in time, because there's no way that you don't, especially if we're supposed to believe the POTS thing, right? So I don't think that they were necessarily surprised. I also think that their immediate concern when informed that Kenzie was driving centered on her, and how to protect her. I think they became very defensive right off the bat because it was, oh, well, she was driving. And if we're to believe this POTS thing is real, there's some liability there on them, 100%. And I will say that I do think they cared about Dom to a certain extent, but not as much as they cared about their daughter and protecting her in whatever facet that was. We cut away from the body cam footage of the hospital to the interview with Kenzie's parents. And something someone noticed on and commented about in my TikTok comments was that the dad's wearing a shirt that says boom on it in a comic book font. And part of me wants to give him the benefit of the doubt, because I try to believe the best in people until proven otherwise. But the other part of me is very cynical about it, because I think no matter how you look at it, it's very tone deaf. And if it was an innocent apparel choice, it's interesting to me that at no point in time did he stop and go, maybe this isn't an appropriate shirt to wear. And the fact that the mom didn't stop him from wearing that shirt either is very ridiculous, in my opinion. As the interview begins with both of them, the mom starts to cry. I use air quotes for that. She blinks a lot, her mouth downturns at the edges, her voice cracks, but there's no tears. There's no actual welling of water in the eyes. She actually ends up mirroring some of the behaviors we see Kenzie exhibit later on in her own interview. And then the dad, to his credit, doesn't even try the crying method, which, I guess I appreciate, because don't try and bullshit the situation. But he's off-putting in and of himself, because he doesn't react really emotionally at all. And I think part of the reason they're trying to portray themselves in the way that they feel they should be perceived is because they can't be overly emotional about it, because they ultimately don't think that Kenzie is responsible for Dom or Davion's deaths at all. So in the grand scheme of things, if they don't think she's responsible, why would they really feel bad about it to that extent? And at the end of the day, their emotions aren't really reflecting their mentality, right? We can see the disconnect because they don't actually feel sad about what happened to the level that they are pretending to be sad about it. The dad also immediately starts talking about Kenzie rather than Dom or Davion in reference to the accident that happened. And what's amazing to me is how he states Dom was allegedly part of the family and then just immediately disregards Dom's life. So it feels like a lot of lip service, and very much like we know we need to be acting this way, and we know we need to get sympathy, but they're too stupid to realize that it's not working. And honestly, people are going to hate you anyways. You might as well just be honest about it. Now, I will say, when the news gets broken to Dom's dad in the documentary, his shock and surprise seems very real to me. But I think that's also because he's not just thinking about Dom. He's automatically thinking about the gravity of the entire situation in a way that Kenzie's parents weren't. He almost right away says, quote, 2 kids are dead and 1 is in the hospital, end quote. And he's sitting with the information as a whole, rather than, like I said, what Kenzie's parents do, where they briefly acknowledge Dom before disregarding him and focusing in solely on their own child. And To play devil's advocate, they are parents, so it's not inherently wrong for them to care more about their kid than somebody else's, but I really don't think that they sat with what actually happened. I think they really latched onto the part of Kenzie's at fault for this accident. What are we going to do? And not, oh my God, she's hurt. She could die. And there's two people that are dead. The next clip we have in the documentary is of the vigil for Dom and Davion, where we get another look at Rosie and we also get introduced to Bubba. And what I find notable is that Bubba looks almost exactly the same in present day as he did at the time of the accident. And this may have been like a directorial choice. However, I think it really speaks to the fact that both Rosie and Bubba, at face value, are just stuck in time. They are two individuals who haven't been able to grow and develop beyond their high school personas and their high school year. And we as a society often joke about people who peak in high school, but Bubba and Rosie are a prime example of this in real time. They are stuck in the past, and they still very much behave like juveniles rather than adults because of this. Now, some people might say, oh, well, that's due to the trauma, but I don't think that that's the case. I think they really they felt so sure and so confident of themselves. And they were popular at the time, and now they're not. And their entire friend group has dismantled, and they don't really know what to do with themselves, and they don't know how to cope with that. So instead of growing and developing as you would expect, they're clinging to the past, hoping that it's going to give them some type of reassurance instead of just moving on with their lives. Next, we move on to Davion's father, and I have to give this man a lot of credit. Side note, he kind of reminded me of John Green and Hank Green a little bit, which was oddly comforting, but I digress. So Davion's dad's, like, his patience, his grace, his understanding, and just general willingness to forgive is so admirable in my opinion, because no matter how tragic the loss of Davion was for him and his family, he still kept Dom in mind and he still kept Kenzie in mind. Even at the end of the documentary, he's willing to try and give her the benefit of the doubt. He goes on to even include their families in like his prayers and his concerns. And I admire the hell out of that. I also want to take a moment to talk about Davion's sister, Divine. I am someone who loves my siblings wholeheartedly. I would die for them. And I cannot imagine or really fathom the loss that she experienced, because you can tell how much it hurts her not to have Davion around. And I really want her to know that I'm really sorry for her loss and what happened to her, because if that were my brother, I would be devastated. I don't know how I would get out of bed in the morning. And at the end of the day, what happened to Davion is beyond tragic. Frankly, it's inexcusable. That never should have happened to him. He was, at the bare minimum, bare bones of it all, he was collateral damage that never should have happened. It never needed to happen. And I can't imagine how it feels knowing that his life was seen really as expendable by Kenzie and Kenzie's parents. So I just wish that Divine knows there's a lot of people who've watched the documentary, who see her pain, who see her family's pain, and are very angry with how Davion was treated in all of this. And I hope that they know they're not alone with the love that people have for Davion and how people understand that he really just was disregarded in all of this. And I don't think that that was fair. We then cut to the prosecutor who enters the case, and we get some information about the crash as a whole, which is that the primary impact is on Dom's side. Kenzie was the only one wearing her seatbelt, and then Davion is actually on top of Dom. At this point in time, weed and mushrooms are also discovered at the scene. And we want to keep all of this information in mind when it comes to later analysis. I talk about it right now, but I want to talk about all of it in one spot, so just tuck it away for later. Just save it in your little mind crevices. We have Kenzie's parents back on screen, much to my chagrin, and they're trying to explain why it is that they lawyered up so fast, because investigators really want to talk to Kenzie, and they're like, that's stupid. Why would we want that to happen? And the part that really gets me is how the mom and dad communicate with one another here, because it doesn't feel organic. The mom tries to justify why she lawyered up so quick, because she looks at the dad, basically points to him and says, well, you told me to, which to me is really stupid. And then there's this weird little pause before the dad's like, oh yeah, right, I did. And it just looks like they didn't talk about this beforehand, and they're trying to confirm their story and version of events in the moment. rather than having planned how they were going to talk about this, which also leads me to believe that there's probably some deception going on as far as that goes. It's not organic. It looks stupid and it looks false. In my opinion, in the real world, had they talked about this before or had this been a natural interaction, it would have gone something like, "Hey, Steve, I remember that like Steve mentioned to me that we should probably have a lawyer at some point, and so that's why we did what we did." Easy, easy, and not like, "Hey, remember when you told me this, right? Nudge, nudge, wink, wink." Like it just would have been different. It would have come up so much more naturally. Now, as someone in law enforcement, I will say the whole lawyer thing is kind of a double edged sword because you absolutely have a right to a lawyer. I can't deny you that. And there are instances where cops have absolutely effed up and put innocent people in prison. And I hate those cases because I sit there and I'm like, how the fuck did any of this happen? But that's not always the case. And so, in my experience, the people that lawyer up right away who won't answer legitimately any question like, "Hey, what happened?" Um, they're usually hiding something that they know will either paint them in a bad light or really show that they're guilty. I myself had a crash accident that happened with some kids on prom night, shocker, and they were driving recklessly, and the car they were in actually flipped and then launched itself into a building. And when it comes to juveniles where I live in my state, parents are entitled to be there for questioning, right? So we notified dad. And the dad immediately lawyers up for his kid who was driving the vehicle. And the reason this happened is because the kid was street racing and he really shouldn't have been. And so again, if this was a situation where it had been a legitimate accident, like let's just say they were trying to switch lanes, they misjudged the distance, and they accidentally clipped a vehicle, they lost control, and then they went like down the ditch into the side of the building. Whatever. That stuff happens. But instead of just saying, yeah, that's what happens, and you lawyer up, and I find out later that like you were street racing or something, like it's stupid, right? Just be honest. Okay. That's all I have to say on that, right? So I'm just like, you can have a lawyer. I'm not going to fault you for having a lawyer. Sometimes it's really important, but other times it just makes you look way worse than you would otherwise if you just answered the freaking question. Then we get to the part where the mom, Natalie, talks about police taking Kenzie's phone. And she acts like they were very forthcoming with this, super cooperative, didn't have a problem with it at all. But her face and her body say that she's very displeased by this. The entire demeanor around Kenzie's parents is that they can't believe someone is accusing their daughter of doing something wrong in the first place. And what they fail to realize is that in any fatal accident, there is an investigation. It is the same with unattended deaths, right? Law enforcement has to follow specific procedures. They aren't treating Kenzie differently than they would anyone else in a fatal accident. They're not targeting her and going, "Oh, your kid sucks. We're going to pick on her in particular." That's not how it works. And they are just so delusional and self-centered enough that they actually perceive that she's being targeted for no reason when it was a fatal car accident. So, if you watch the clip where Kenzie's mom is being asked about the phone and she's like, "Oh, yeah, we gave it over to police," she actually shakes her head no and adjusts her body position multiple times, which indicates discomfort. She is very uncomfortable with the topic of Kenzie's phone being taken. She's quite frankly pissed that it happened, especially with the way that she throws her hands up like this, palms up. That is a pleading gesture. That is what somebody does when they're wanting people to believe them and they're pleading for somebody to actually find what they say. Like they want people to think it's valuable information. And sometimes it's an innocent gesture, right? Like sometimes people put their hands out, not a big deal. But in this case, it's, you got to believe me. We were actually like okay with this, when in reality, everything about her demeanor is saying, I actually really hated that this happened in the first place. We get another unfortunate interview segment from Rosie. Now, I'll be honest, Rosie pisses me off so much, and I, I really have a hard time putting my finger on it, but I think part of it is because she's so similar to Kenzie, and if I'm being honest, I think their friendship was more of a business transaction than anything. I think Rosie saw it as an opportunity to mentor, I say in air quotes, Kenzie, who she talks lowly about in this interview clip because she talks about how Kenzie wanted to be like her and how she had such a large following and Kenzie didn't, etc. I think Kenzie is very narcissistic. I think Rosie is very narcissistic like Kenzie, but she lacks some of the other personality issues that Kenzie has, which I'll discuss later. And the way I see their friendship is that it is very shallow and it is not as deep and meaningful as Rosie wants people to think it is. And I think Rosie overall did the documentary and the interview for popularity reasons, because the other friend, Faith, seems much more down to earth, much more in touch with reality, and very level headed compared to Rosie. And when she talks about why Kenzie is her friend, she's like, Kenzie kept me from being bullied, and I really appreciated that. Whereas Rosie's like, oh my God, Kenzie wanted to be a model like me, and that's why we were friends. Like, it's just so superficial and shallow, and it just reeks of bullshit. And before I forget, I also think Kenzie 100% had an eating disorder because that girl does not look healthy at all. And I was very surprised nothing was ever explicitly mentioned about it in the documentary. They do make comments about how, like, she ate super organically and things like that. But when you look at her and the fact that you can see all of the bones in her rib cage, in her shoulders, like, it's just not healthy. It's not good. A 17-year-old kid should not look like that. And there's pictures of her, like, holding up her, like, crop tops, and I really think that there were other issues going on there that just weren't talked about or acknowledged. I don't know if that's due to time issues or what, but if any of you guys know more about that, feel free to let me know down in the comments. I would love to hear from you. We then learn about Dom and Kenzie's relationship and how all of that started. Dom was 3 years older than Kenzie when they met, meaning that they met when she was 13 and he was 16. Quick side note, it actually wasn't until my second rewatch that I realized I'd actually seen one of Kenzie's TikToks before, and it was specifically the Minion movie one. So that was really weird. The first time I was like, wow, this looks weirdly familiar. And then it hit me on my second rewatch where I was like, oh my God, I actually saw this on the app. So that was very interesting, but I digress. So, as mentioned in my own TikTok, Dom and Kenzie should have never been a couple. And this is more of like a personal opinion on my end. A 13-year-old and a 16-year-old have no business dating. And that's not to make Dom the bad guy here. I want to be very clear about that. What I mean and what I have a problem with is that Kenzie's parents should have nipped that shit in the bud, and they didn't. My mom told me point blank when I was going into high school, she said, no junior or senior has any business dating a freshman. They want one thing and one thing only from you, and that shit stuck with me. Frankly, Kenzie's parents are actually like, they're very lucky Dom didn't end up being an awful piece of shit, because I know they see him that way after the crash, but before the crash, when things were supposedly going great for Dom and Kenzie, like, he really could have been an awful guy to their kid. Like, it could have been way worse than him just supplying her with weed and mushrooms. He could have sex trafficked her. He could have abused the shit out of her. Like, they are so lucky this didn't go south the way that it did. They are so lucky. And then while we're talking about the relationship with Dom and Kenzie in the documentary, Kenzie's dad and mom are just grinning from ear to ear. And Kenzie's dad, Steve, is like, quote, the boy wasn't hurting for money, okay, end quote, which felt very inappropriate. And the way I see it is they were happy Kenzie became Dom's problem and Dom's financial burden more than their own. Because you can't tell me that even with how shitty they were, Kenzie wasn't exhausting to parent. Granted, they allowed her to be that way, so it's their own fault. But I firmly believe that they were like, okay, great, she's with Dom. We don't have to worry about her anymore, when they weren't parenting her in the first place. And to be honest, using the word parent for how they raised her is very generous. I think that this really indicates that they were also very aware of how Dom was getting his money, which was by dealing marijuana and mushrooms, maybe even some other drugs. And again, not something that's the end all be all of evil, but definitely something that my parents would have had to stick up their butts about, because you don't know what people Dom is interacting with. It may be that Dom's a great guy, he's just in probably not a great profession, but the people that work in that profession with him are awful human beings and they could like abduct Kenzie or something. Like you don't know. And I feel like they took a lot of risks allowing this relationship to develop the way that they did. And they got very lucky that Dom was actually a good guy in the grand scheme of things, because this could have been way different. We then move on to Kenzie's parents, where they explain how they had to tell Kenzie that Dom was dead. And the mother, again, tries very hard to make herself cry. She actually scrunches up her entire face, but again, there's no tears. There's nothing that comes out. And the dad, who otherwise seems pretty indifferent throughout this whole thing, just rubs at his face, covers his mouth, like strokes his beard. And this type of gesture is done by somebody who doesn't really know how they need to react, but knows they need to do something, who has a lot of anxiety and just needs to do something to get the energy out. At the end of the day, it's a self soothing gesture. Like he feels that he needs to be doing something because it's an uncomfortable topic, which is good. He should be uncomfortable. The next thing that gets brought up is the amnesia issue, which again may make sense, but the amnesia situation where it's only one block of a particular incident feels weird to me. So I did do some research on amnesia because I wanted to understand it better and I wanted to have more of an educated opinion on it. And what I found is that there's multiple types of amnesia, but the most likely one here is post-traumatic amnesia, which is like common in traumatic brain injuries. This takes place after some sort of traumatic incident that results in an injury. And one symptom that can happen as a result of amnesia is called confabulation. And this is when your brain automatically tries to fill in memory details and ends up making a mistake. An example of confabulation would be like you're trying to remember the day that you went and you ate a hot dog, or like what clothes you wore 3 weeks ago. Um, but you're remembering it incorrectly. Like you give the wrong set of clothing or you give the wrong date. And it's not that you're lying, it's just that you're misremembering the details. Additionally, people who have amnesia may not be aware that they have amnesia right away. There's often extensive confusion before people figure out, oh, it's amnesia. Like there's just a general lack of understanding as to why they can't remember certain things, and there's frustration there. So I think the fact that they were so quick to say, oh, it was amnesia, means it probably wasn't amnesia, because that's not what somebody's first thought goes to, right? Because it's quite rare for people to have amnesia. So it's just interesting. We also have to remember that there's different types of amnesia within the post-traumatic amnesia, such as localized or generalized amnesia. And generalized amnesia centers around entire chunks of time, whereas localized amnesia is more specific and may target only select memories. But it still encompasses an entire event, meaning that the likelihood Kenzie remembers all of the events leading up to the accident, but not the like 5 seconds before the accident itself, is very unlikely. Based on what I read, and again, I'm not a doctor, I don't know everything about amnesia, it would be more likely that she doesn't remember the entire car ride rather than I remember everything leading up to the 5 seconds before we crashed. Obviously, the fact that she was found unconscious at the crash as a result of the impact, like her not remembering that specific stuff or those details would make sense. Like I think we can all accept that, because being unconscious is also technically a form of amnesia in and of itself. Like I said, not an expert on amnesia, but I think based on what I've read, the possibility of this very specific circumstance, which even if it's not impossible, it is very unlikely for things to play out the way that Kenzie is claiming it played out. We then have Davion's friends reveal the path Davion, Dom, and Kenzie took in the car on Life 360. Now, quick shout out to Life 360. This is not sponsored, but that app is amazing, and I highly recommend it, especially for your loved ones or your friends. It's actually helped quite a few times to locate people with Alzheimer's or dementia who've actually wandered out of care facilities but have had their phones with them. It can help, like, if your car breaks down on the side of the road. Like, I recommend looking into it because I think safety-wise, it can help a lot. Next up on the docket, we have the drug usage on Kenzie's part. And as far as weed goes, like, I'll agree with Steve here. There's worse things you can use, but that's not all that she was using. And such persistent usage of marijuana in and of itself for an undeveloped brain is problematic. The most common finding is that cannabis use in teenagers leads to slower cognitive development, meaning that while Kenzie is 17, physically, she may not cognitively be developed the way that a 17-year-old would be because of the marijuana usage. And that's not even talking about like the mushrooms or what other hard drugs it was that she was using. And so, what also really pissed me off is how Kenzie's dad talks about smoking dope. We see how good he is at deflection because he immediately jumps into, well, I don't care if you smoke dope. I don't care if I smoke dope, etc. Because the question was about Kenzie. It wasn't about anybody other than Kenzie. And instead of holding her accountable, he starts discussing other people's habits instead of the habits of his own child. And as soon as we get done with shithead Steve, who pissed me off already, we move back to dumbass Rosie. And she's like, quote, we were the stoners kind of a little bit, end quote. And the usage of kind of and little bit are minimizers, meaning one of two things. She didn't really like being a stoner and didn't want to engage in that lifestyle, but she did to be socially accepted, or she was way more involved in stoner culture than she wants to admit. And personally, I think the latter is probably more accurate. And I think Rosie's overall defensiveness surrounding the incident is because she probably feels a sense of responsibility for what happened. And on top of that, she knows more about Kenzie than anyone else. So she's going to protect Kenzie and protect that information because, in all reality, she could have been Kenzie. They are so similar, it's ridiculous. And to be honest, she probably feels like any attack on Kenzie is an attack on her as well. Also, side note, I hated every time she said, quote, the mushrooms. She just sounded so stupid. You can just say mushrooms. Yeah, they kept talking about taking the mushrooms. You can just say they kept talking about taking mushrooms. You don't need the, you dumb, stupid lady. Listen, I don't know why it makes me so mad, but it does. Anywho, I also take some pleasure because I think that Rosie, in her infinite stupidity, really helped solidify that the crash was premeditated because she was so invested in defending Kenzie, she actually damages Kenzie's entire story by advocating for how sober Kenzie actually was. So if they were going to use any sort of sobriety defense, that statement really gets Kenzie in trouble because Rosie effectively eliminates any excuse Kenzie has of substance abuse being the cause of the crash. And in my opinion, this is very much a case of thou doth protest too much, as my mother would say. We then get the crash footage, which was very shocking to watch. I actually just watched the documentary on the Boston Marathon bombing before this, and I immediately thought when I heard the car accident that this sounds like one of those bombs going off. It was very jarring, to say the least. And it was sickening because the only thing that I could really think of and picture when this video clip happened is Dom and Davion knowing what's about to happen and being completely helpless to stop it. And when I think about it, like it makes my skin crawl and I despise it. I hate it and I feel sorry for them because I can't imagine that. And like, I'll be honest, I have a weird relationship with death, right? It scares the shit out of me. But it also comforts me in a weird way. And like, I believe in God, but I also recognize that there's a chance nothing happens after we die and there's no other plane of existence. And the idea that there's a universe which potentially exists where Dom and Davion die and there's nothing for them after this terrible accident just really upsets me. And I hate it. Like, I had to sit with that feeling of like, this sucks for a good while after watching it the first time. It's a very difficult thing to witness and to conceptualize and try to rationalize and be logical about. And on one hand, I want to be hopeful that like, yes, they went to heaven exists. But on the other hand, knowing like there's a very real possibility that that is the finality of their existence. And I hate it. Davion's dad then discusses the brand deal that was sent to Kenzie. And the fact that Kenzie's mother answers first says a lot to me because it gives two primary possibilities. Number one, she wanted to get ahead of it so Kenzie can reply and say, well, my mom said I could, so that's why I accepted it. Or two, she's living vicariously through Kenzie and is like, oh my God, I always wanted to be this cool and popular. And now Kenzie is. So like, I'm going to jump in on this and be part of this. But the one part that really bothered me is the line from Kenzie's mom saying that Kenzie may be hurting more than anyone else. And I honestly wanted to reach through my phone screen, wrap my hands around her neck, and just strangle her because the audacity of that statement is insane. And this idea that Kenzie could get paid with a brand deal after murdering two people and her parents are okay with this means that honestly, the apple doesn't fall far from the tree. The fact that throughout this entire incident there was no survivor's guilt is really telling to me. What you see a lot in situations like this is, if this is a genuine accident that was not supposed to happen, somebody going, how is it that I was the one to survive? How is it that they both died and I didn't? Why am I alive? And there's this sense of depression and this sense of guilt and this sense of shame. And that just does not exist for Kenzie and her family, which is also why I think this is very clearly premeditated. We go back to shithead Steve, who's opening his big dumb mouth again, and he actually openly admits at this point that he just doesn't hold his child accountable. And what's amazing to me is this man very clearly thinks that he's very smart and intelligent and like such a great parent, but he cannot see that throughout his child's entire existence, she has done nothing but manipulate the hell out of him. Like between Steve, Natalie, and Rosie, they are probably the most delusional people in this documentary. And it infuriates me. Like, I get it. As a parent, your kid being a shitty person is something that's probably very difficult to come to terms with. But also, you need to be the first person to recognize when your kid is being shitty. I worked in the juvenile detention system for probably a year as a detention officer. And what I learned there is that the kids who actually had a chance of coming out better in the grand scheme of things had parents that gave a shit and were willing to discipline them. The kids that didn't have parents that held them accountable and just said, oh, whatever, like they're not doing anything wrong, those kids were in the system for years and then went into the adult system. If you are not going to hold your kid accountable, at the end of the day, you are just enabling your kid and honestly encouraging them to enter the justice system. Legitimately, in my opinion, Kenzie's parents are a very large reason that Dom and Davion are dead. If they had done their job the way that they were supposed to as parents, there's a likelihood that this never happens. And I personally hate that they're allowed to sit there and act like God's gift to parenting and like their kid is an angel sent from heaven. I hate it. Because I can tell you right now, like Dom's parents and Davion's parents, they're very open. Like Davion's own dad even admits Davion is flawed. And that's what a parent should do. A parent should be able to accept the fact that their kid isn't perfect. And seeing Natalie and Steve completely incapable of that is infuriating. Thankfully, shithead Steve goes away, and then we start to learn about the car's black box info, which is very eye-opening to what really happened. We have to consider the steering input and the speed, as well as the gear shift going from drive to neutral. Again, keep this info in mind because we're going to talk about it later, even though it was kind of discussed in the documentary already, but you know what I mean. So Dominic's friend comes into the police station and he talks about the domestic violence in Dom and Kenzie's relationship, which I felt this should have been touched on more, but it wasn't, so I'm going to touch on it now. Now, detectives ask why Dom sticks with Kenzie, and one theory that I posit is that since Kenzie knows Dom deals drugs, she could very well use that info and just hold it over his head. She could threaten to turn him into police at any given moment. She could threaten to tell his family in case they weren't aware. Like, there's a plethora of possibilities that she could have done. And I personally have seen this behavior happen in custody issues, domestic violence issues, like all sorts of familial and domestic related disputes. This mentality of, well, I can just get you in trouble for X, Y, and Z. And what sucks is a lot of times there's such a real fear and possibility of this happening that the individual who is being abused in the relationship will stay. Essentially, they're being blackmailed, right? And I think that that's part of the reason why Dominic may have stayed as long as he did, because of the information that Kenzie had on him. We also at this point get a big reveal that Dom had cheated on Kenzie in the past, which will be important when I discuss the likely pathologies and personality disorders of Kenzie, so make note of that as well. We then have Dom's dad talking about how he would try to spend time with Dom, but wasn't able to do so because Kenzie was very controlling. And this is another common tactic that is seen in domestic violence, which is isolation. Isolating someone from their family or even some of their friends who aren't okay with the behavior that's happening, and then consequently controlling who they are able to go out with, talk to, interact with. And we see this in some of the messages Kenzie sends Dom, where she's constantly asking him, "Where are you? Who are you with? What are you doing?" Now, some of this does stem from the fact that Dom cheated, which cheating is never okay. But regardless of the cause for this behavior, it's unhealthy, it's abusive, and it's damaging. There's, at this point, a few videos of Kenzie post accident where she's being wheeled around in a full body cast or crying at the gravesite, etc. And we get to see Dom's family mourning with her. And knowing what happened and the type of person she is, it just sucks to watch this because I personally can't comprehend the amount of betrayal that they felt when shit hit the fan and it was revealed what type of person she really is. Um, but these videos of her being sad, of crying, they're all for show. Um, People do grieve differently, don't get me wrong, but at a certain point, it's over the top. And what these videos seem to be portraying is a cry for sympathy and a mentality centered on self pity. Well, feel bad for me. I'm the one that lived and I can't live without them. Boo hoo, poor me. Oh, look at me. My body's all broken and shattered. The videos themselves aren't focused on Dom or Davion and the loss of them. They are focused on Kenzie and how sad she is and how this is supposed to have impacted her. It is a very self-centered, but like a very self-centered video campaign, but it's disguised as something that's like selfless and just emotionally consuming. Next, we have Angelo, who's Dom's brother, talk about the domestic violence issues in the relationship and how Dom was preparing to leave Kenzie, which it's common knowledge in a lot of true crime spaces that the most dangerous time for a victim to leave uh, is let me rephrase that. It's common knowledge that the most dangerous time in a domestic violence relationship is when the victim is leaving or getting ready to leave, which lines up very well with the events that took place. And the fact that there's evidence Kenzie attempted to not only break into the house that Dom has, but at certain points keeping Dom from leaving. Like, all of this is very stereotypical DV stuff that I've seen in the field. And so when the next topic is the incident where like Dom is messaging his mother saying, Kenzie threatened to crash the car and kill us. Like, when you look at it through a lens of domestic violence, it makes sense because Kenzie would send those messages to people on purpose to try and claim the opposite. This is something that happens all the time in domestic violence issues, where when the victim calls police and the abuser realizes that they're on the phone with dispatch, they will also call in to try and get ahead of the narrative. So when Kenzie learns that Dom's contacting his mom and is like, "Oh my God, Mackenzie just said she was going to crash this car and kill both of us," Kenzie's like, "Oh shit. Well, now I have to get ahead of this and I have to talk to his mom or whoever it is about what's really happening. And I have to let them know that it's actually Dom who's the bad guy." And so this isn't like the bombshell that her parents think it is. This is just classic domestic violence behavior. Next in the timeline of the documentary is Kenzie's arrest. And boy, do I have a lot to say about this. Because Kenzie immediately being pissed that someone tried to grab her phone is really funny to me. Because when you're under arrest, you don't just get to keep your phone on you. Whatever is on your person gets confiscated and kept separate from you in the patrol car. Like, your property does not belong, like, it still belongs to you, but it doesn't get to be in your possession at this point in time. Like, that's just not the way that it works. And I also think it's hilarious that her mother immediately is like, "Well, we have a lawyer. I'm going to call the lawyer." That's great, Natalie. But having a lawyer doesn't mean that she doesn't get arrested, especially when there's an arrest warrant. So I don't know what magic button you think you're going to be able to push to reverse what's happening, but it doesn't fucking exist. Like, they are both so out of touch with reality, it's infuriating. And then we have shithead Steve going on about how, "I don't know why they needed 9 or 10 cars. Well, maybe it's because your daughter is a murder suspect, you dumbass." And also, she's with other people in the car, like her mom, who clearly won't let her daughter be held accountable for anything. And there was probably concern about Kenzie trying to flee or her parents intervening, etc. Like, there's a rule in law enforcement, which is if you can outnumber and outgun the bad guy, you do that. Because people are less likely to resist when they are very clearly outnumbered, right? It's a psychological power play. It's done intentionally. It's not that your daughter is being targeted for no reason, you delusional fucks. There is a reason here. I also hate that Steve is like, she's only a 17 or 18-year-old little girl. Like, I don't know if you're aware of this, Steve, but 17 and 18-year-olds can still try to have shootouts with cops, flee, steal cars, do all sorts of crazy shit. Just because she's a girl and she's 17 years old doesn't mean she's this innocent little handy-dandy angel baby. She killed 2 people. Regardless of whether or not it was murder, she killed 2 people. Like, I don't know if he genuinely thought she was never going to get arrested, because even if it wasn't murder and the circumstances were different, let's just say it was the actual Potts thing, like, you can still get charged with vehicular manslaughter, which also still has jail and prison time. Like, I just don't think the dots connected for any of these people. And it's just baffling, because how are you this delusional? Like, I know why you're this delusional. It's because you're stupid and you're narcissistic, but it's so aggravating. And to be honest, Kenzie's lucky the cops even handcuffed her in the front, because they don't have to do that. They were being nice. I also think it's important to note that at the time of Kenzie's arrest, there's no cast or sling on her arm at all. However, in the trial, you'll notice she's wearing an arm sling, something that I believe was done to encourage sympathy for her. Something that people do all the time, where like they'll wear a cross necklace even though they killed 13 people. Like, common tactics to try and gain sympathy points. Now, when Kenzie is taken to jail, she's informed that she's under arrest for aggravated murder on 2 counts. And in the body camera, you see there is absolutely no reaction on her face. Now, someone who legitimately had nothing to be guilty about would have had something to say about this, or would have had some type of reaction. Like, let's just say this was a vehicular malfunction where the gas pedal got lodged or the brake wasn't working, like complete total accident. And they were like, oh yeah, you're under arrest for murder. That individual would be like, what the hell are you talking about? I didn't kill anybody. She has a completely flat face, flat expression, just nothing. Now, to play devil's advocate, maybe it was that she was just in shock. I don't know, but I think it's probably more likely that she had already mentally prepared for this to happen at some point. I think she had kind of accepted that at some point something like this was going to happen, but I also think she thought she could get out of it even if it did happen. We get people's reactions about the arrest, and the biggest one for me was Rosie's, because her statement, quote, "The last thing I thought was she was going to get arrested. Our friends are dead. How are we going to recover from this?" End quote, or something along those lines. And this is so fucking self-centered, it's not even funny, because she's not even remotely concerned about the families of Dom or Davion. Her immediate thought process is, how do I get to feel better and move on from this? What about me? What about my friends and my friendship group? It does not at all come across that she is concerned for anybody other than herself. And to be honest, I think a small part of her was probably jealous by all of the attention that Kenzie was getting, along with the attention that Davion and Dom were getting, and how at the end of the day, nobody ended up giving a shit about her. Again, why I think she was partially motivated to do this documentary in the first place. And at long last, we hit the part in the documentary where Kenzie sits down for her interview. And one thing I noticed in the second watch is that she actually stylized her little prison uniform. She has one edge like tucked into the seam of her pants and the other one untucked, which is a style that I've seen plenty of people do. She also sits in what's described as a very defensive posture. So she sits with her arms crossed and then she leans in. So she's immediately closed off, and then her leaning forward posture is a challenge. She's making it clear in her body language that she's not open to criticism and she's going to defend herself. And the arms being crossed over her torso is also a self-soothing gesture, and it's also one of protection because she feels vulnerable, which she should. And that's probably why her lawyer was there as much, is because he knows for a fact she's going to talk herself into a bad situation. But she had every right to be nervous. She had every right to feel vulnerable. And to be honest, if she felt that way and she was this scared, she never should have done the interview in the first place. But she is so narcissistic and egotistical that she's going to get everything that she can out of it to try and make herself look like the good guy and also get as much attention as possible. Now, as soon as the interviewer starts questioning her, her expression shifts into this one of like doe-eyed, sad sincerity. And he hasn't really even asked her much of anything, and she's just automatically laying on the emotions the way that an actress would. Like a director said action, and she's like, "Oh, I'm so sad, feel bad for me." And she maintains this expression throughout the interview because she knows the way she should be acting. However, she fundamentally sucks at effectively portraying this. Her mentality does not at all match the projected feelings that she is trying to relay. She also speaks in a very soft, breathy voice compared to the way she talks fiercely and authoritatively in her social media posts, as well as the posts where she is arguing with Dom. She has a very carefully engineered demeanor here. This is not like just how she is casually. And as Kenzie talks, she stares directly at the interviewer for extended periods of time, not wanting to break eye contact. And what she's doing here is she's gauging whether he believes her or not, whether she can convince him. And as she talks, she bounces drastically between emotions in a way that's jarring. She gets asked about her anger issues, and she goes from smiling to that brow furrowed, like sad doe-eyed look because she remembers, oh, that's how I'm supposed to be feeling. I'm supposed to be sad about this. But it's not a natural and organic transition. It just looks wrong because it is wrong. Kenzie then discusses Davion and states that he was more of Dom's friend than her friend, and this creates a degree of separation and depersonalization. She's creating distance between herself and Davion and somewhat mirrors, like this behavior mirrors what her mother says at sentencing when she's like, well, Davion was just a newer friend, as if that impacts the fact that he's dead at all. By doing this, Kenzie is basically saying, well, Davion's death is Dom's fault, because if Dom and Davion weren't friends, Davion wouldn't even be there in the first place. And we know this is a lie because we know that Bubba and Davion were also very close, which means Davion was more integrated in the friend group than Kenzie is willing to acknowledge or admit. Kenzie is then asked about her version of events, and at one point she says, quote, my whole life was shattered, end quote, but she's unable to hide a very clear smile and stifles some weird sound where she almost sounds amused, but is like, oh shit, like I can't laugh, which is very incongruent with the topic that's being discussed. Because on one hand, you're saying that your entire life is over as you know it, but at the same time, you're smiling and you think it's funny. The documentary then transitions to the trial at this point, where we learn Kenzie opted for a bench trial. And I think she chose the bench trial because she firmly believed it'd be easier to manipulate one person over an entire jury, which to me seems a little ass backwards because you'd have a better shot getting a hung jury, in my opinion. But at the end of the day, nobody said that she was smart, so it is what it is. It didn't end up working in her favor regardless, so I consider that a win. At this point, we also kind of have to talk about the POTS issue. Now, I do not have POTS, so I'm not going to speak on the medical condition itself. However, if Kenzie had passed out, the vehicle would not have maintained course. When you take your hands off the steering wheel, which I'm pretty sure we've all done at some point in time just to like see what happens, your car starts to drift one direction or the other. It doesn't just maintain a straight trajectory. That's just not how it is. And that's impacted by like road grade, slope, all sorts of different physics, right? So again, doesn't make a lot of sense. And then the impact being on Dom's side also makes a lot of sense. Anyone who knows that an impact is coming is going to try and protect themselves in any way, shape, or form, even if that means angling the car to be hit on the passenger side first. The boys, in my opinion, based on the steering input and what the prosecutor said, did attempt to correct what was happening, but they weren't able to do so. They honestly just didn't have enough time. And I believe that Kenzie intended to force Dom's hand into being with her and not breaking up with her. Whether it was a bluff that went wrong or a murder-suicide is kind of up to interpretation, but I am somewhat familiar with murder-suicide and the psychology and pathology behind it. And while the defense and her friends were saying, you have to be suicidal for murder-suicide to be possible, suicidality is not a requirement. You don't need to have a history of suicide or suicidal ideation. All you need is the will in the moment. Murder-suicide cases in this scenario stem, like 9 times out of 10, I made that statistic up, but it's a lot, from a history of domestic violence, a sense of external stress and desperation, as well as the breaking down of a relationship. And we have to think about what Kenzie would lose if Dom broke things off with her. She loses a place to live. She loses the money. She loses the party lifestyle. She loses the expensive clothes, and she loses the drugs. She loses basically everything. And sure, at the end of the day, she could go be with mommy and daddy, but it's not the same. There's not the same inherent freedom. And these feelings also stem from an ideology of, well, if I can't have Dom, then nobody can. And, well, we're better off dead anyways, you know? So I think it's very likely that what happened was a murder-suicide. And unfortunately, Davion was just collateral damage. I really don't think Kenzie thought about Davion at all. I don't think he crossed her mind. And we know that she had no legitimate excuse based on the steering input, the lack of drugs, the fact that the car had a straight trajectory, etc. So again, it lends to the murder-suicide theory. Now, one thing I do want to mention is that she very much had THC in her system. And part of this could be because she smoked every day, or it's because she smoked before driving, etc. She had THC in her system. But you can absolutely get a DUI for marijuana. The last DUI I did was for marijuana. And I actually had somebody mention in the comments on my TikTok that the reason the prosecution probably didn't push the DUI issue is because it would have hurt the case, by saying, oh, well, she was impaired enough that it couldn't have been murder. And so whoever said that, I don't remember what your username is. Very good point. Very sharp, not assumption, but analysis. So thank you for that. I'm very glad that you mentioned that because I didn't think of that. So thank you. At this point, I'm kind of done with the documentary in itself, and I kind of want to try to answer some of the questions that you guys had for me on TikTok. And honestly, the biggest one was really just like, what the hell is wrong with Kenzie? And what came to mind for me off the top of my head were borderline personality disorder, narcissistic personality disorder, and antisocial personality disorder. Before I talk about any of this, I want to make it very clear that I'm not a doctor, so this is educated speculation. Now, what is borderline personality disorder? BPD is a mental health condition based on emotional instability, issues with self-image, generalized behavior, and then issues with relationships with others. Some of the hallmarks for this include intense mood swings, fear of abandonment or rejection, increased impulsivity, self-harm, and a rapidly changing sense of self. So how does this apply to Kenzie? Well, first and foremost, we can see how amped up she can get. It is very clear from the evidence that was presented that things can escalate very quickly with her, and witnesses state her affections and mood towards Dom and other people would fluctuate rapidly. Then we have the fear of abandonment. We know Dom cheated, which likely fed into this issue. But I think Kenzie was abandoned in other ways as well. I think she was, at the end of the day, abandoned by her parents emotionally. I think they abandoned her. I don't think they took care of her the way that they should have. And I think that there's probably some underlying issues there that she has with her parents that will probably never be discussed. But I do think that plays into it a little bit. Next, we have her impulsive nature, which is incredibly apparent. She's drinking, she's smoking, she's taking mushrooms, she's driving erratically. She's like, oh, I'm going to break into this guy's house because he made me mad. She just lacks critical thinking skills and just straight up emotional regulation. Self-harm, while not super apparent, can be seen just in the car crash itself, but also the self-destructive behaviors that she engages in. I also think that, like I said, there's probably an eating disorder in there somewhere that just wasn't talked about. As for Kenzie's sense of identity, Kenzie wants to be literally anything and everything. Kenzie wants to be the mean girl, the nice girl, an influencer, a stoner, all of this at once. She cannot make her mind up on who she wants to be or what she wants to be. She's in this weird state of limbo where she is constantly shifting to fit her surroundings in order to be accepted by other people, and she doesn't have a real legitimate sense of identity. Next, we have narcissistic personality disorder, which is indicated by a persistent pattern of grandiosity, a very overwhelming need for admiration and attention, and then just at the base of it all, a lack of empathy. Kenzie, it was made very clear in the documentary, needs the most expensive things imaginable. She got freaking Gucci sunglasses, which doesn't make any sense to me, but whatever. She, at the end of the day, needs to show that she is better than other people by whatever means necessary, whether that's looks, finances, job, social status, whatever it may be. That is her goal. That is what she wants to accomplish. Um, this sense of self-worth that she has and this desire for attention really just build on one another in a very self-destructive cycle. And Kenzie genuinely thinks that she is smarter than other people. And she's not. She's actually very dumb because I don't think she should have done this documentary at all because I think it hurt her more than it helped her. But her parents also did the same thing. So whatever. Apple doesn't fall far from the tree. She also needs a lot of attention or she's not going to feel fulfilled. Which, again, I think is why at the end of the day she accepted the brand deal despite killing 2 people. I also think that's why she filmed herself grieving the way that she did, as well as like with the full body cast. It was for attention. I don't think she can stand or fathom that Dom and Davion were getting more attention than her. And for a narcissist, any attention is good attention. As for the lack of empathy, I don't think I need to elaborate on that. I think it's pretty apparent. We then have antisocial personality disorder. At its simplest, ASPD can be defined as a pervasive pattern of manipulating, exploiting, and violating the rights of others. Some of the most common characteristics are as follows, which is lack of responsibility, disregard for right versus wrong, impulsivity, aggressiveness, and violence, problems with authority and structure, and then lack of empathy and lack of remorse. Kenzie very clearly does not take responsibility for her actions. Her parents don't either, so that seems to run in the family. She's also an aggressive person. You can see with the way that she talks to people, the way that she acts on social media. And she obviously has issues with authority and being told what to do. I don't think I really have to elaborate a whole lot on this one in particular because if you watched the documentary, you know why this is here, you know where it fits. That said, I personally am a firm believer that Kenzie is a sociopath. She is able to have an understanding of right and wrong better than a psychopath, but she just actively ignores it. She is also much more erratic and volatile than a psychopath, especially emotionally. That said, she still has a lot of characteristics rooted in psychopathy, but I do think she leans more to the sociopath side than the psychopath side. On to the next question. Somebody did ask me, like, is this a nature issue or is it nature versus nurture? Like, which side am I on? And what I will say is that I am never a diehard person of it's only ever nature or it's only ever nurture. I think people who sit in those camps are just factually incorrect. I don't think that that's possible. Now, can nature or nurture impact more than the other? Absolutely. And to be honest, like while you can't separate the two, I think that this case is more heavily based in nurture. I think a lot of what happened here could have been avoided had her parents actually given a shit about her and actually parented her. A lot of the behavior we see from Kenzie is behavior that we can also observe in her parents. Um, this may sound very mean to say. I don't think, I think to a certain extent they do love their kid, but I don't think they love their kid a way that a parent does. And that's not to say like, oh, this is romantic and incestual. It's just, I know my parents love me because they expect me to behave appropriately. They hold me accountable when I mess up, and they're still going to be there when I mess up. That's how I know that my parents love me, and that's how I know they love me like a parent would. I think that they love her more as a friend than they do as a child. I think there's a lot in that relationship that wasn't talked about in this particular documentary, which I know people say is probably referenced in like the Hulu series and elsewhere. But again, we're talking exclusively about this documentary. Somebody asked, like, what about the grooming gestures and what does that really mean? So, in general, grooming gestures are done to self soothe, and they happen most often during a spike of anxiety. If you're, stressed about a situation, you're being asked a difficult question, or you're uncomfortable. A lot of times, this happens if you're caught in a lie or if you're very overcome with emotion. In other instances, they are done less subconsciously and in more of a selfish nature. For instance, when Kenzie fixes her hair in the middle of the interview at the end. This gesture is done for the sole purpose of presenting herself to be as appealing as possible. And somebody else who was also very well known for doing this was Jodi Arias. She did this a lot as well. Then again, the eating disorder. Somebody else had mentioned that they kind of noticed what I did. And I think, to be honest, that Kenzie had a lot of issues that were just outright ignored by her parents. And her parents just exacerbated the issues, which caused future problems. Her parents weren't willing to see that she needed help. And they really, in all honesty, damned their daughter to the life that she currently has. But they themselves are so self-centered, they can't even see or accept that. I think that if Kenzie got help, she may have been able to avoid this. I think that there's a slim possibility she gets the help she needs in prison. She's able to come out of this a better person by some miracle. And in some future, let's just say she confronts her parents about their shortcomings. I don't imagine a world where they would agree that they failed her. I don't imagine a world where they would hold themselves accountable for their own shortcomings. I could almost put money on it. I would say, let's just say she gets released in 15 years. I hope to God she doesn't. And she confronts her parents. She's a better person now. She's been to therapy. She's medicated, whatever it may be. And she confronts them and says, like, you guys really did a shit job, but I don't see a world in which they take accountability for that. And it sucks because I think this is a prime example of some people just shouldn't be parents. And that's just how it is. And it sounds really crappy and it sounds really shitty, but there are so many kids that get screwed over and end up being awful bad people because of the life that they were born into. Do I think that she always had a propensity to have this type of behavior? Yes. Again, the nature versus nurture issue, right? I think it was always in her nature to a certain extent, but it was exacerbated by the nurture side of things. That's pretty much all I have to say on the documentary as a whole. We're at about an hour and 6 minutes, so a pretty long deep dive, nothing too egregious. Took me about 16 pages to write this up, but a very interesting case. And at the end of the day, what I want to say, and somebody had brought this up as well, where they were like, well, I don't feel bad for Dom because he was selling drugs. At the end of the day, right? Dom and Davion are two people who had families that loved them, who had relatives that wanted to see them grow up, wanted to see them be successful in life. Their lives had value, whether you agree with Dom selling drugs or not, doesn't matter. He still had value in his life. He did not deserve to die the way that he did. Davion did not deserve to die the way that he did. They were done so wrong by somebody who just does not care. And that is the real tragedy of the situation. And I don't want people to lose sight of that, because while we did talk about Kenzie a lot and Kenzie's parents a lot, at the end of the day, the people who are hurt by this the most are Davion, Dom, and their families. And they have gone through a lot of pain and a lot of suffering. And I know that every time a new, documentary comes out on this, or anytime they see it and it gets brought up, they're probably thinking about what happened. And I hope they know that there's a lot of people that are on their side that understand what happened was wrong, and that a lot of people do care about Davion and Dom. And I think a lot of people could say, if it had been Kenzie who died instead, they would have been okay with that. Does that make it right? No. But I mean, it just really sucks that in cases like this, right, it's the perpetrator that lives. And it's the people who don't deserve to die that die. It's no different than a drunk driver, right? How many times do you read that a drunk driver hit somebody and they live and the other person dies? It's just shitty the way that it works out. It's not fair. But I hope that with the new media coverage, with the things that are coming out, it helps people hold Kenzie and Kenzie's family more accountable than in the past. And I hope it makes people realize she needs to stay in prison. That's all I have for you guys. Thank you for watching. Thank you for commenting. Thank you for being invested and involved in this. If you want to listen to this more on the podcast side, this is available on YouTube, Amazon Music, Spotify, and Apple Podcasts. You can watch this as a visual media on YouTube if you would like. If you like this content, please don't forget to like, comment, and subscribe. I'm going to be continuing my I-45 series. I just needed to do a little bit more research on this next set of cases, because I'd rather push out content that's developed and taken that's developed and done delicately and ethically than like just pump something out for the sake of, views and things like that. So without anything else to talk about, because I will go on a tangent here, thank you guys for watching. Please take care of yourselves. Please stay safe out there and stay psyched out.